Welcome to Just Ace, a podcast about the 90s Australian alternative music scene, whatever the hell that means. Hi, I'm Danny. I grew up a music fan in Australia in the 90s. In fact, my entire teenage years coincided with the 90s. I turned 10 in 1990 and I turned 20 in the year 2000. And like every other music fan on the planet, my teenage years was when music changed my life. The thing is, I grew up in Australia in the 90s. Like the alternative explosion that marked the 90s around the world, Australian music went through a huge change in that decade. In the UK, they called their scene Britpop. In the US, they called their scene grunge, to begin with anyway. In Australia, our journalists forgot to give the scene a clever name. Ozternative? Who knows? And it's too late now, but this podcast is about that nameless scene. So I'm going to talk about a lot of bands. Some of them were huge in Australia, some stayed underground. Some had small overseas audiences. Bands like The Hummingbirds, Rat Cat, Clouds, Frente, The Cruel Sea, You Am I, Silverchair, Spiderbait, Regurgitator, Powderfinger, The Foes, The Whitlams, Jebediah, and many more. And I'm going to talk about the culture around it. TV shows, radio, music festivals, magazines, and much more, with names like Triple J, Rage, Recovery, Juice, Drum Media, and others. But it's not just a list. This is a story. It's the story of a generation of bands, artists, labels, and the people around them, and how this thing called alternative music developed, and what it was an alternative to, and how the thing it was an alternative to ended up killing it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This is also kind of my story. I'm taking a page out of some of my favourite music books written by people who lived at a time in music and wrote about it. Clinton Walker's Stranded, Giles Smith's Lost in Music, and many others. So it's a deeply personal story of Australian music in the 90s. And if you don't like that, well, then lucky you didn't actually have to live my life either. So I'll talk about how I felt about this whole scene, and some of my encounters with the people, what I learnt, and what I wish I learnt. By design, I didn't record interviews with anyone, although I spoke with a lot of people. If you were there and you want to add to this or set the record straight, please get in touch, let me know, we'll work something out. This isn't an exercise in nostalgia. I love history, but I want history to be alive. So many of the bands and music and culture is still relevant today. I would say that the story of how this underground scene rose and ruled and then fell again is as relevant today as it was back then. It's how art and culture works and how it always works. And it's what I want to talk about. And so much of the music remains good. Yes, some of the drum sounds and haircuts have dated badly. And yes, a lot of it was terrible as well. But some very talented artists captured the times in great melodies set to incredible backing music. At the very least, I would like to elevate the bands to a big enough profile on the world's internet so random metal bands from Germany stop taking their names. But if you've never heard of any of these bands, that's okay. I'd like to think there might be some new bands for you to discover or some interesting stories or other fun to be had. So here's how it works. This podcast will be in seasons. The first one is 12 episodes, and the current plan is the others will be around the same. We will kind of be working our way from 1990 to 1999, but it's really just a springboard to talk about various topics and bands. Every episode looks at one part of the story, like chapters in a book. Sometimes I will talk about radio stations or magazines, or the story of a label or a festival. Every so often I will talk about one band in particular. Sometimes I'll talk about a year. So it's a little different week to week, and mixing it up is the point. Think of each episode as a little radio documentary. A lot of research went into this, and other things that came from the research will be on the website, along with lots of show notes and playlists. In fact, just about every episode could be spun off into a book or a documentary or something else. There's so much more story. Producers and publishers, please get in touch. Like every other podcast, I've set up ways of supporting the podcast. Everything, the production, editing, website, artwork, etc. was done by me, although lots of friends helped with advice and feedback. I also want to keep this ad-free and independent, in keeping with the spirit of the music that I'm talking about. So supporting the podcast is the best way to do that. There's a Patreon, of course. There's only one tier at the moment. It's a simple support tier with a couple of very basic benefits. If the podcast does well, I will make more stuff. And those patrons will get a discount, or I'll offer a higher tier where they get it for free, if I ever get there. There's also a tipping service called Buy Me a Coffee. Links are in the description, but hey, have a listen first and see what you think. If you do like it, I encourage you to tell a friend and leave the podcast a good review. That's kind of how the internet works. If you want to let me know what you think, you can find the podcast on social media under the name Just Ace 90s, which is Just Ace 90s. Links in the description as well. Or email me with any questions, justace90s@gmail.com. If I get enough good questions, I might do an extra Q&A episode. Again, if I ever get there. Okay, that's it. Next week, we start with episode 1. We start with the thing that changed everything for Australian music in the 90s. Except it happened in 1989. Thanks for listening.